Hi class, welcome back. In this video recording, we'll be talking about chemical compounds, and we'll be reviewing some of your basic chemistry concepts. So again, hopefully this is all a review from last year from physical science, but it should help refresh you and get you ready to study the overall subject of biology. Remember, in our last video, we talked about the cross-cutting concepts in biology and the fact that biology, while one discipline of science, typically contains many other disciplines, and chemistry is one of those things that we need to study in order to fully understand biology. Our learning targets in this video are going to be that you can identify the 3 subatomic particles found in atoms. At the end of the video, you will be able to explain how all of the isotopes of an element are similar and how they are different. You'll be able to explain how compounds are different from their component elements, and you'll be able to describe the 2 main types of chemical bonds. Now, there are other types of chemical bonds, so things to keep in mind, but we're just going to focus on the 2 primary chemical bonds that are used in biology. So let's go ahead and get started. Hopefully you guys can remember what an atom is. An atom is, I would say, the cell is the basic unit of life, and so the atom, you could think of the basic unit of matter, right? You can pull apart an atom and focus on its subatomic particles, subatomic, and we'll talk about this in just a minute. But when we're talking about matter as a whole, as a composition, that comes from the atom. Atoms are important for us because they make up the elements that make up the compounds that make up the you that we'll be focusing on. All right, so when you look at the size of an atom, we're talking about something really, really, really small. So you could put 100 million atoms all side by side, and you would get something like maybe a centimeter long. So we're talking about something really minute. And when we look at the atom, we can even break it down further to some of its smaller subatomic particles. Can you remember what they are? Protons, neutrons, and electrons. So remember, we've got our protons, we've got our neutrons, and we've got our electrons. Each of them have their very own specific properties. You can think about P for positive, so protons have a positive charge. Neutrons, N for neutral, neutrons have a neutral charge. And E for electrons, and I don't have anything catchy for you for this one. Just remember that electrons happen to be negative. Because protons are positive and electrons are negative, the number of protons in an atom typically equals the number of electrons in an atom because most atoms have a neutral charge overall. They're not positive and they're not negative. If they become positive or negative, they start to form things like ions. And we'll talk about ions in a second. I have some examples of some elements here with their protons, electrons, and neutrons. In this diagram, protons are represented by red dots, neutrons are represented by blue dots, and electrons are represented by yellow dots. Remember that protons and neutrons are found in the nucleus, which is the center of the atom, and electrons are found outside in what we might distinguish as shells. Shells become important when we talk about different types of bonds, but more on that in a little bit. Okay, so let's keep going. Here we have another diagram of what an atom might look like. In this representation, the electrons are represented by these little negative signs. Protons are the positive and neutrons are the unfilled little dots. Now, here is another example. We've got the subatomic particles of helium. You can see that in this case scenario, the number of protons and the number of neutrons and the number of electrons is all equal. Now, this brings up an important part, and that's talking about the atomic number and the atomic mass, or the mass number. In helium, for example, the atomic number is 2. You remember from last year that the atomic number is the number of protons that are found in the nucleus. The mass number represents the overall mass of the atom. Remember that electrons are super, super, super tiny, and so their mass is essentially negligible, which means we don't really count it. Have a mass, it's just really small. We've arbitrarily assigned a 1 to protons and a 1 to neutrons. So every proton has an atomic mass number of 1, and every neutron has an atomic mass number of 1. So the mass number is the total number of protons and neutrons. For helium, the mass number is 4. There are 2 protons and 2 neutrons, thus a total of 4. Again, hopefully most of this is review, but it's good to cover some things because when we talk about chemical bonds, I just want this stuff to be fresh in your mind. Okay, so now we can dive into talking about elements and isotopes before we talk about chemical bonding and chemical compounds. Remember that a chemical element is a pure substance that consists entirely of one type of atom. You could have 100,000 million carbon atoms. You still only have carbon, the elements. So here are some examples. We've got carbon and we've got sodium. Both of these are elements you can find on the periodic table. Now, let's do a quick check. Can you find the atomic number of carbon and the atomic number of sodium? The atomic number of carbon was 6 and the atomic number of sodium was 11. You'd be correct. You can see those up here in the corner, 6 over here and 11 down there. What if I asked you to find the mass number of carbon and the mass number of sodium? Could you identify those? The atomic mass of carbon is about 12, and the atomic mass of sodium is about 22 or 23, depending on how you round. So these are some skills, again, you should have remembered from last year, but if not, here's a quick review for you. So remember that these different symbols are used to identify the elements. So C is for carbon and Na stands for sodium. Remember that this doesn't always correspond to their English names, but rather the Latin names of which these words stem from, which is why sodium, even though it starts with an S, is abbreviated in A. You're going to want to be able to recognize some of these. While memorizing them is not necessarily going to be beneficial, over the course of the class and over the course of the year, you're going to slowly start to recognize a lot of these chemical elements and chemical compounds. That's because you're going to use a lot of them and frequently. Okay. So we already know that the number of protons in an atom of an element is the element's atomic number. And even though there are over 100 elements on the periodic table, only about 20 of them are found in most living organisms. And only about 6 or so of them are quite prominent. So these ones in the periodic table or in our mini periodic table here are some of the major elements you'll find in living organisms. These 6 elements over here make up about 99% of all living organisms. These 6 major elements are calcium, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Now, all of these other elements are important. In fact, a lot of these elements are considered trace elements. And if your body doesn't contain or have access to trace elements, you can develop a number of serious problems. However, we tend to focus on the big 6 right here, because without these, we can throw off your homeostatic balance, and then, ultimately, you could die. But despite what you may think, not all elements are created equally. In fact, sometimes they're created with slightly different masses. And that's where we get isotopes. Isotopes are atoms of the same element that have a different number of neutrons, therefore they have a different atomic mass. An example of this would be carbon-12 and carbon-14. Carbon-12 and carbon-14 are both elements of carbon. They're both carbon. However, carbon-12 is a little bit lighter than carbon-14. That's because carbon-14 has 2 extra neutrons, whereas carbon-12 only has 6 neutrons. Carbon-14 has 8 neutrons. These isotopes are important and used for a number of different things in the body. Or in scientific research. This is because scientists can use these different isotopes in order to help tag and trace various processes throughout a living organism's body. Another example would be 2 isotopes of hydrogen that you can see over here. In this isotope of hydrogen, we only have 1 proton. And this isotope of hydrogen, we have 1 proton and 1 neutron. So, still hydrogen, but with a different atomic mass. Because they have the same number of electrons, all the isotopes of an element have the same chemical properties. Remember from physical science that it's the presence of electrons that actually give certain elements its chemical properties. So the only thing we're really changing is the mass. Remember that neutrons have a neutral charge, so they're not changing the charge of the element in general. They're, again, just changing the mass of the element. Now, in addition to just having isotopes, we also have these fascinating things called radioactive isotopes. Radioactive isotopes play a critical role in scientific study, particularly in biology. When we talk about radioisotopes, what we mean is isotopes that are relatively unstable or break down at a constant rate over time. Because of this, we can use radioactive isotopes to determine the age of rocks and fossils, treat cancers, kill bacteria that cause food to spoil, and use them as labels or tracers to follow movement of substances within an organism. In fact, you'll look at a number of experiments this year that use these radioactive isotopes as tracers. A lot of what we know about DNA and the discovery of various cancers and certain biochemical processes come from the ability to use radioactive isotopes in scientific discovery. Now that we've talked about some of the basics and we've done a quick crash course on things like chemicals and elements and things like that, now we can start talking about chemical compounds. Elements are found naturally in the body and they're very critical, but what's more important are the chemical compounds that these elements compose. Chemical compounds have properties that are slightly different than the elements that make them up. One of the best examples is table salt is composed of sodium, super reactive, and chlorine, a deadly poisonous gas. Put them together and they're one of my favorite things. So a chemical compound is a substance formed by the chemical combination of two or more elements in a definite proportion. So we're not talking about something simple like a heterogeneous mixture. We're talking about a chemical combination. The example I have on the screen for you is water, composed of hydrogen and oxygen. This simple chemical compound is essential for life as we know it. You'll be dealing with lots of chemical compounds, many of which are quite complex. Chemical compounds are so important, we've come up with a way to abbreviate them. We use something known as the chemical formula to abbreviate the chemical compounds. This is where really understanding the periodic table can help you identify what is in a chemical compound. So, for example, water is H2O. It's composed of 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen. We have table salt, which is sodium chloride, or sodium and chlorine, sodium chloride, which is composed of 1 atom of sodium and 1 atom of chlorine. Then we have hydrochloric acid, HCl, which is composed of 1 atom of hydrogen and 1 atom of chlorine. And the last example I have for you is glucose, which is 6 atoms of carbon for every 12 atoms of hydrogen for every 6 atoms of oxygen. And you'll deal with glucose quite a bit, especially second semester. So these show you the exact proportions of how certain elements bond together chemically to create chemical compounds. If the proportions are off, then the chemical compound is different. For example, water is H2O. If we were to change the proportions, and instead of just having 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, and change it to where we have 2 hydrogens and 2 oxygens, we would no longer have water, but instead we'd have hydrogen peroxide. Which, call me crazy, but I don't think anybody will be drinking hydrogen peroxide in the near future. Now, in order to make these chemical compounds, we have to hold things together via chemical bonds. There are 2 major chemical bonds that we're going to talk about. So, the atoms in a compound are held together primarily by chemical bonds. The electrons that are available to form these chemical bonds are called valence electrons. Remember from physical science that electrons are held in the shells of the atom. The first one can only hold 2, the second one 8, and so on and so forth. The electrons that are available for bonding are only those electrons found in the outer shell or the outer valence, the valence electrons. What happens in a chemical bond is that these 2 outer shells or these valence electrons overlap, come into contact, or get exchanged. The example I have for you here is water, and in our next video and in your next lesson, you'll actually spend a lot of time focusing on water specifically, so I won't spend too much time on it here. But you can see the electrons represented by these little blue dots are interacting, but only those in the outer shell or the valence electrons. So the 2 main types of chemical bonds that we're going to talk about are ionic bonds and covalent bonds. And you can think about it this way. Ionic bonds is when we have a complete trade of electrons, and covalent bonds is where we have a little bit of sharing taking place. And this is important because the type of bond changes the way that the elements are going to interact together. So let's start by talking about ionic bonds. An ionic bond is formed when one or more electrons are completely transferred from one atom to another atom. An example of this is sodium chloride. The reason we keep using sodium chloride is because sodium chloride is simple and probably the easiest one to understand. What happens is sodium has one valence electron. It has just one electron in that outer shell. Chlorine has 7 valence electrons. It has 7 electrons in its outer shell. Again, if you'll remember from physical science, both of these elements would really like to have 8 valence electrons. That would make them super happy. It would be very easy for sodium to ditch an electron and give it to chlorine. It would be very easy for chlorine to just grab an electron from sodium. If sodium gives away an electron, it now has 8 electrons in its outer shell here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If it gives one to chlorine, chlorine has 8 valence electrons in its outer shell. It would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, making both of these happy. One thing you have to keep in mind is if we start exchanging electrons, we're going to change the charge of the atom. So remember, both sodium and chlorine are at this point in time neutral because they have the same number of electrons as they do protons. Sodium has a total of 11 electrons and chlorine has a total of 17 electrons. So if sodium gives an electron away, it's going to become slightly positive. That's because it's now going to have 11 protons, but it's only going to have 10 electrons because it gave one away to chlorine. Chlorine, on the other hand, is going to have 17 protons, but it's going to have 18 electrons because it gained one. If you do the math, that means sodium is going to have a positive charge of 1, and chlorine is going to have a positive charge of 1. If chlorine had accepted 2 electrons, it would have a positive charge of 2, a negative charge of 2, and sodium would have a positive charge of 2. But again, we just exchanged 1. We call these negative and positively charged atoms ions. Ions, when you hear the term ion, you know that there has been an exchange of electron, and now we have a positive or negative charge attached to this element. So now we have a sodium ion, called a cation, and a chlorine ion, called an anion. The negative one is the anion, and the positive one is the cation. As we have a strong positive and a strong negative, the positive and negatives on these two atoms attract them to one another and hold them closely together. You can think about them like a magnet. Magnets have a positive end and a negative end, and they kind of stick together because of that attraction. So the same is true for sodium and chlorine. They act sort of like magnets to one another because you have a slightly positive charge and a slightly negative charge, which draws them together. Even though they've completely exchanged their electrons, this new negative-positive interaction holds them together. Another type of bond that we'll work with a lot this year are covalent bonds. Covalent bonds typically are identified by the sharing of electrons. When electrons are completely shared between one atom and another atom, you're dealing with a covalent bond. Again, a nice, strong bond. The goal here is still to fill those outer shells, and we like a full 8. In the case of hydrogen, a full 2 in our outer electron shells, or these valence electrons. So water, or H2O, is a great example of a covalent bond. Here, hydrogen shares its 1 valence electron with oxygen's 6 valence electrons. And this happens twice. So we have here once, oops, sorry about that. We have here once and here twice. This gives hydrogen a 2 in its 1 shell on both hydrogens, and it gives oxygen a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 electrons, but again, being shared. Now water, we'll talk a lot about in some of our later lessons, but water is a great example of how electrons aren't always equally shared. Even within some covalent bonds, you can have partial and negative charges, but you'll get to that a little bit later. So covalent bond forms when electrons are shared between atoms. So here are some other examples for you. We've got H2 or molecular hydrogen, or O2, molecular oxygen, and here we have a single bond bonding at 1 and 2 electrons here. And then with oxygen we have a double bond, and you can see the double bond here and here, here and here. Another way you can represent these bonds is by looking down here. We've got 1 dash for a single bond. This shows you how those electrons are shared. So this hydrogen is sharing, this hydrogen is sharing 1 electron with this hydrogen. Here in the oxygen we have a double bond showing that we're sharing 2 electrons. Both oxygens are sharing 2 electrons. And then in rare cases, you can even have a triple bond, and one of those is nitrogen. Nitrogen can have a triple bond, and you can see nitrogen here in the corner sharing 3 of its valence electrons. Both of the nitrogens are. When bonds happen, we get what's called a molecule, which is why I said molecular hydrogen and molecular oxygen. So when covalent bonding occurs, we get what is known as a molecule. A molecule is when 2 atoms are held together by covalent bonds. That's a little bit different than a chemical compound in which atoms are held together by ionic bonds. They're held together differently, right? In ionic bonds, you're held together from that negative and positive force. In covalent bonds, you're held together by the sharing of these electrons. So some things to keep in mind as we move forward. There's also other types of bonds that we're not going to talk about, including these things called van der Waals forces. Van der Waals forces are kind of a weak interaction that still allow things to take place. When molecules are close together, slight attractions can develop between the oppositely charged region of nearby molecules, and these are called van der Waals forces. We'll also talk about the interactions between water molecules. Water molecules have this slightly negative and positive charge, which gives water some of its really cool properties. So there are other types of bonds and other types of forces out there. We're just not going to emphasize them too heavily. This lesson, we'll talk a little bit about hydrogen bonds, which have some of those weak attraction between negative and positives. So, as a wrap-up, are you able to identify the 3 subatomic particles found in atoms? Take a minute. Protons, neutrons, and electrons. Can you identify some of their properties? Maybe their charge or their mass, or where they're located? Can you explain how all of the isotopes of an element are similar and how they're different? First of all, what's an isotope? Do you remember? I think it has something to do with mass. And what makes one isotope different from another isotope? You should be able to do that. If not, review. Can you explain how compounds are different from their component elements? What's a chemical compound? And why is it different than an element? And then finally, can you describe the 2 major types of chemical bonds that we talked about, ionic and covalent bonds? If you can do all those things, then you're on track. If not, this would be a great opportunity for you to either review this video or check out your textbook or review some of your notes in class. Anyway, it's been great, and I can't wait to see you in our next video. Happy learning!